students need to lower the bar a little bit. We need to have these 4 hours of blocked out time to study. The reality, that's probably not going to happen.
How can I help them systematize that, where we're bringing these concepts from previous units?
The pendulum's swinging too far in the other direction too. Most of the time, people don't have to study everything to do well on a test. They just have to identify the part that they don't know well.
About how do we help people learn?
You can't train all your body parts in one day. You really just have to break it down into smaller chunks.
What are some good strategies that students could use to...
There's one thing for you to have that in your brain somewhere. And then there's the active process of going to get that file in the brain.
If you had one piece of advice to students, what would be the one thing that you tell them?
Be aware of the fact that you're probably going to get freaked out.
Hey there, so in this video, I'm having a conversation with Dr. Seth Jump. He's an anatomy professor and a podcaster. He's got a podcast called Anatomy on the Go, which teaches you anatomy in kind of these bite-sized chunks so you can listen to them on the go while you're doing dishes or driving, that sort of a thing. And he's had a lot of experience just working with students and helping students learn how to learn better. And so that was a lot of our conversation. What are the myths that students believe? How can we do some mindset shifts that'll help us to learn better? How do we encode the information? How do we practice the information so that we really learn it? And how do we learn the information whenever we just got busy lives? We got a lot of stuff going on. So it was a really great conversation. We covered a lot of topics that I think you'll learn a lot from if you're a student of anatomy or anatomy and physiology. And so we'll jump into the conversation. Hope you enjoy it. All right, Dr. Seth Jump, thanks for joining and talking about how we learn anatomy and physiology. Thanks for being here.
Thanks a lot for having me join. Appreciate it.
Yeah, I love the podcast. That's kind of how we got connected. Is as I'd listened to the podcast, and one of the ideas that you've kind of talked about some is, you know, when we do a study session, we don't have to sit down for 7 hours, 8 hours and do this long, massive study session. There's all over YouTube. There's these videos that are study with me or how I study 8 hours a day. Like I've seen that video come up. But the reality is for most people who are learning anatomy and physiology, they don't have 6 hours at a time to sit down and study, right? And so even something like a podcast, to be able to have that in your ear and be listening and sort of studying when, you know, like the podcast says, on the go, that's something we'll talk about a little bit later, just how do we fit in the studying that we need to happen. But one thing that I wanted to talk about here is, you know, why are we having this conversation? And so both of us as teachers, right? Like I've taught high school anatomy and physiology primarily, as well as online through the YouTube channel, is that we see students who they really struggle with anatomy and physiology. On my end, it's they do well in A&P in my class, and then they go to college, and then they take maybe anatomy and physiology in undergrad, and suddenly the rate at which they're having to learn anatomy and physiology is just so much faster, and they're just inundated with this absolute flood of information, and suddenly they just don't know how to keep up with it. They don't know how to learn efficiently and quickly where they can keep up with all that information, and then they get to their tests and they're not scoring very well, and then they end up having to change their major. And so, you know, this is something that I've sort of had a passion about, learning more about how do we help people learn, because I want students to get to college and be able to be successful, because there's so much information out there that is known, but most students don't know it because they haven't learned it in school yet. How did you know, I know in your content too, you teach anatomy and physiology concepts on the podcast, but you also have talked a lot about how we learn. So tell me a little bit more. How did that kind of come up on your side?
Yeah, it's understandable with A&P, and we'll just stick with anatomy, that there's just thousands and thousands and thousands of different parts and pieces and origins and insertions and blood vessels. And so you really just have to break it down into smaller chunks. So let's talk about the heart. You know, we have a few inputs into the right atrium. Learn those and then move on to the right ventricle or the left atrium. Just go in order. Or if we're talking about muscles, just start with the anterior arm. You know, learn bicep brachii, coracobrachialis, brachialis. Just learn those cold with, you know, learn the actions, origins, and insertions, maybe an innervation, a blood supply. Just break it down into smaller chunks, because it's easy to be very, very, very overwhelmed by the sheer volume of content. And I think you sort of train, you think about it in terms of training, and you can't train all your body parts in one day. That doesn't really make sense. Let's just go ahead and train our arms, our shoulders, our chest, our tries, the whole deal, our legs, and then we're just going
to don't skip leg day though, right?
Exactly. Yeah, I mean, it just doesn't make sense from a training standpoint. You just sort of break it into smaller pieces and do what you can on a single day, recover. And plus, people are busy too. They've got kids. They're maybe working a job on the side while they're trying to learn. So you really just have to break it into smaller chunks and pieces and work from there.
Yeah. Like what you said, yeah, with the smaller chunks thing, like if you're learning those different muscles, yeah, it can be overwhelming because there's just so much to learn. But then your professor immediately is moving on to a new topic, the next class period. Yeah, not get overwhelmed and, like you said, break those down into chunks and stuff. I think that's good. Quick thing, if you're feeling overwhelmed by your A&P class or exams or just the sheer amount of information that you're supposed to learn in anatomy and physiology, you're not alone. That's actually really common. But here's the truth. The real game changer isn't spending more and more hours studying. It's not even watching more of my YouTube videos, but it's learning how to learn effectively. That's the skill that helps you to actually retain all of the information that you're learning and not just wasting time rereading notes and then forgetting all that stuff that you were supposed to learn. That's exactly why I created the A&P Memory Lab. It's a 5-week program where I teach you how memory actually works and how to make the anatomy and physiology content you're learning actually stick in your brain's long-term memory forever. You'll save hours of study time, feel way more confident going into your exams, and move closer to your goal of becoming a nurse, doctor, physical therapist, whatever your career goals are, all without the stress and burnout that often comes with studying A&P. If that sounds like what you need, check out the link in the description. I'd love to see you in the A&P Memory Lab and to help you achieve your goals. So part of the point of our conversation here is just to think through and discuss ways that we can help students learn smarter, not harder, not with necessarily more time, but more effective kind of strategies and stuff. I wanted to start a little bit with some of the myths that we've seen. And a big one for me that I've seen is that students tend to want to use study strategies that feel easy. Mm-hmm. Right. And so, a common metaphor for this is, if you go work out, you're not going to go to the gym and do the easy stuff. You're going to do the stuff that like pushes yourself, that makes you breathe heavy and then your muscles start to ache, all these kinds of things. Because when it comes to working out, we know that those are the things that are going to grow our muscles and make us more fit. But when it comes to learning, we tend to do the opposite. Mm-hmm. We go for these strategies that are ineffective, but they feel easy. And so they make us feel kind of smart because it's, hey, I'm just rereading my notes and I can understand it. And that makes me feel smart because I'm not having to work very hard. Right. Mm-hmm. So what are some strategies that you've seen students use that aren't very effective? And then other strategies that you've seen students use that, okay, that's what we have to do to be able to learn and remember this information.
Yeah. To go back to the gym analogy you gave there, it's sort of the right amount of difficulty. If you're trying to put, 345s on a bar, like, that's probably too hard for most people. At least it's too hard for me. And as you're putting only on, you only have the bar itself, like that's probably too easy for a lot of people. So it's kind of the right amount of tension, so to speak, and the right amount of information. So I think, like, to relate to the example you just gave, it is like, I think a lot of students are simply just kind of reading their notes, kind of rehashing their notes. They're not actually working with the content, and they're not truly thinking of it about it from different angles and understanding the ins and outs of the anatomy. So that is an ineffective thing I've seen a lot of students do. They're not truly thinking through it, and it's fun to think about it. It's fun to say, have somebody ask you a question. Okay, so we're talking about abduction of the shoulder. What's the prime muscle that does that? Now, can you name some other muscles that do that? And so then they start to work through, okay, what are some other muscles that maybe initiate abduction, assist on some level with that? And so it's really about working through the content in a way that sort of hits kind of that happy medium. It's not too hard, but it's not too easy. So you're training the brain and sort of give a little bit of grace to oneself too. Like, okay, you sort of just learn it one chunk at a time. You get better and better at it. Think of anything else that's been difficult to learn. We didn't know anything about how to do it, a sport or other skill, and you sort of just add these little pieces, one piece at a time.
Yeah. And it takes us like it takes this idea of being uncomfortable and being okay with being uncomfortable. Like you said, I'm just thinking of learning a new sport. When you learn a new sport for the first time, like you're not going to be very good at it.
Yes.
You're gonna do the thing, and it's going to feel awkward. But a lot of times, if we're doing a new activity like that, we're more okay with it. Like if I go axe throwing, I've only been like a couple times, but the first time I went axe throwing, I was like, this feels so, and I don't know why that one came to my mind, just because it's not something I do very often, but something that where I don't know what I'm doing, but I also didn't care because I didn't expect myself to be good at axe throwing, and nobody else did. We're just there to do this random new thing. Versus when it comes to learning, we've been learning for so long, and part of our identity might be wrapped up in learning and school and our performance. And so when we take this risk and do this effortful practice, and we don't remember the thing, then suddenly we start to feel, oh man, maybe I'm feeling stupid, and that's not part of who I am, and that's scary, you know? So I like what you're talking about with the abduction of the shoulder there, and obviously you'd have, you know, like the deltoids would be one of the main muscles that's abducting the shoulder, and then you mentioned kind of asking what are the other muscles that initiate abduction and all of that. And I know there's some rotator cuff muscles there that are involved in that as well, and it makes me think if you're learning, let's say the muscles of the arm, one of the things you're doing there is starting to categorize them in a new way. So rather than just being like, here are all the muscles on a diagram, now you're thinking through, okay, what are all the muscles that do this action?
Uh-huh.
And then maybe again, you categorize it in a different way. You say, what are all the muscles that I've learned here that have an origin on the scapula?
Yes.
You know, what are the muscles? Like there's different ways that you can start to categorize those. And also using that as a way of chunking. And that reminds me kind of what we said with, or I don't know if we talked about this one yet, but this idea that people have that anatomy is mostly memorization.
Uh-huh.
And there is this aspect of memorization, but also you're not just going through and memorizing this muscle and then this muscle and then this muscle and this muscle, because then you've got, you know, hundreds of disparate facts that aren't related to each other. And that's really hard to keep it in our brain if we have these unrelated facts, right? But as soon as you take all of those muscles that you started to learn and you start to categorize them, so say, here's the muscles that abduct the shoulder. Here's the muscles that the adduct the shoulder. Here are the muscles that now I'm on the spot here. I'm trying to think of all the different motions of the arm and everything on the spot. But we're making these categories, and that's a really good way of making connections between a lot of the information that we have, right? And even with that, you can start to think, you know, if you notice this, I started immediately grabbing my shoulder here and doing this because I was using this kind of kinesthetic movement, right? So I'm engaging all of the different kind of, you know, ways that we learn, right? Visual and kinesthetic and auditory, all these things all at once, and that's helping me remember, you know, the deltoid is working to abduct the shoulder. I think those are strong ways of encoding the information. We're not just sticking with the textbook. We're engaging with all of our senses and everything.
Yes, totally agree. Yeah. I think, you know, related to some of the points you made there, your cheat sheet is actually on yourself. And, you know, you can move your arm in the way that you're examining the muscle itself. So, you know, here we're engaging the brachialis, the biceps brachii, coracobrachialis. If we flex here at the shoulder, you know, if we go back to the abduction example, you know, the supraspinatus is going to kick it in, and then the deltoid is going to take over to complete that abduction. And so really, like, knowing where the muscle is, if you think of it in terms of like a pulley or two strings that are attached to 2 points, it's going to be the action is basically just going to describe itself. So, you know, if you have biceps brachii, for example, you got two origins for that muscle, but then ultimately they converge on this radial tuberosity on the radius. And so if they pull, they're going to pull on the bones of the forearm, specifically the radius, but then they're also going to rotate that radius as the entire forearm gets pulled toward the arm. So it's going to be a flexor supinator. And then the deltoid is really straightforward. It's just, you know, attaching along here, different origins and insertions. Well, one basic insertion, and it's just gonna, you know, pull this abduct the arm. So I always have to slow down and say abduct and adduct and kind of make sure we're all on the same page there. But really, like, if you think of like the attachments, then you're not really even memorizing the action. Like, oh, it's pretty clear. Or you can go in the opposite direction some too,
Yeah.
as
And I
well.
think that's a good point. If you can memorize the points of attachment, you can sort of deduce what the action is from there
You can, yes.
by sort of visualizing it. And it makes me think of it's still this idea of we're moving, we're visualizing, we're processing out loud, engaging all those senses. If you were advising a student on how to learn all of these, what would you have them actually do? I'm picturing I need some sort of 3D model maybe pulled up on my computer. I might need the list of muscles that I'm trying to learn. Do I have a pencil out? I'm doing note. Like, what are all the things that you would have them do to try to wrap their brain around all these muscles that they're learning and bones that they're learning and all of that?
Yeah, just the brief mentions there, I would answer yes. Yes, use all of them. Yeah, go look at the picture, look at your own body, look at the sheet of muscles that you need to be learning, look at origins and attachment, origins and insertions, actions, and put them all together. And people may find that there are certain muscles they just like that makes sense to them just a little bit more readily than other muscles, and sort of just go back and forth. And then I recommend kind of a regional way of doing that, so you can break it into those smaller chunks, whether it be anterior arm and then posterior arm, maybe rotator cuff muscles. You go back down. I went a little bit out of order there, but anterior forearm, posterior forearm, and then hand. And just one at a time. And then, I think, find a good lab partner, a good class partner, where you can quiz each other and ask each other, okay, so which of the following muscles has an origin on the coracoid process and inserts on the radial tuberosity? And, okay, biceps brachii. What's the origin that I left off there? And you go back and forth with each other, and you just do one thing at a time. You just build those pathways in your brain one bit at a time. And then soon enough, you're just getting 1% better. And then, okay, I know all the muscles. Good.
Yeah. So there's one theme that I'm kind of hearing come out a little bit is, we mentioned this. You have all your resources out. You got your 3D model on the computer. You got some diagrams. You got your list of muscles, maybe from your professor's notes or whatever, or whatever it is. You've got all these resources out. You're trying to engage in as many of these different things as possible as you're running through it. But then immediately the next thing you talked about is quizzing each other.
Yes.
So there's this kind of back and forth between I've got all my resources out. I'm consuming this information, and then I put it away. And I think that's one area that a lot of students neglect, is this idea that I've got my notes, I've made some notes, I'm doing all this stuff, but now I've got to take all those supports away for a little bit and try to reproduce that information from my memory. And so this, I talk about this idea of encoding and then retrieval. The encoding is you're taking all this information in, you're trying to connect it to different things, you're trying to understand it. And then the retrieval part is where we really build those lasting connections, and that's where we put that stuff away. And you find the lab partner, you quiz them on things, they quiz you. And I think that's the part that we skip because it's hard, right?
Yes.
That's the hard thing to do. I'm not going to remember all of the origins and insertions, and then I'm going to feel like I'm not smart. But we got to remember that's part of the learning process. The smartest people in the world don't remember everything every time, right? Like they have to go through this process to learn things, right? So what if you're going through this process, then you're ready to do you've done some encoding, you're ready to do some retrieval, you don't have a partner with you. What are some good strategies that students could use to practice that retrieval and try to build those connections better?
Yeah, they could try to do it for themselves on some level. So you mentioned you're referring to the model that you have for retrieval. And so you think about, okay, there's one thing for you to have that in your brain somewhere. And then there's the active process of going to get that file in the brain, which I think, and then you also reference the fact that there's sort of these feelings that crop up of stress, like feeling kind of less than, or I'm not smart enough, or even just fear. Like I'm afraid I don't know the answer to this question. So I think there's actually there's a lack of training on the actual test taking process itself. So it could be writing out flashcards in a certain way for somebody, where they ask, what is the action of the biceps brachii? What is the action of the deltoid? What is the action of the quadriceps muscle group? And split that into smaller parts. What are the different muscles in the quadriceps muscle group? And then go backward and forward. And even one thing that could be effective too is adding a time constraint. Because as soon as there's I get asked a question, for example, and I know the answer, I could talk about the answer kind of in a roundabout way, but I may not know, exactly what they're asking. So you don't have the liberty to necessarily ask a follow-up question in a test, but so I think if you approach that kind of in a roundabout way, be able to answer the question in different ways and answer it under the constraint of time. So I have to answer these 10 questions in less than 2 minutes. And so you get used to being kind of quote unquote under the gun, so to speak, under that constraint, because I don't think that's practiced enough too. Because understandably, it's like I want you to answer these challenging questions, but then do it in 2 minutes. Okay. Yeah. That feels kind of stressful.
Yeah. It reminds me of just, when playing basketball, so I play basketball, and when we're training for games and stuff and practice, we're simulating real game-like situations, right? We're we'll be, hey, we're down by 2 and there's 30 seconds left. What's the play that we're running, right? We're trying to simulate the actual environment that we're going to be tested in, which is a real game situation. But for school, oftentimes as students we'll be learning in one kind of more casual environment. And like you said, we won't add that time constraint, add a little bit of pressure there. And then suddenly we get to the test and our stress levels are just different because now there is a time limit. There is this extra pressure, but we've not practiced that aspect of it yet. So I think that's really great. Train in the way that you're going to be performing.
Yes.
Right. And performing in a lot of times for students is going to be on some sort of a test. So if it's a kind of a lab practical situation where you got to identify muscles, simulate that as best as you can. Get pictures of the muscles that you got to label or whatever it is. If it's a written test, find multiple choice questions that you can use to practice and give yourself a time limit. I think that's great.
Yeah. Related to your idea there, practice as you play. Yeah. Just
play,
if you can bring that in, and if your lab instructor is willing, maybe they'll set up a practice practical for you. And tag different muscles on a model, or different parts of the heart, or different muscles on a blood vessels on a cadaver, whatever it happens to be, run you through it. And if like you mentioned, if you can do it for yourself, great, because there are definitely ways you can do it for yourself with flashcards, or just write down as many questions as you possibly can. But most people can find somebody to work with that they can work with well, and or if their professor is willing, just ask them some questions.
Yeah. Have you ever had students come up to you and be like, hey, I'm trying to do better on my next exam or practical. Can you give me questions? Did you have students that would come up to you and ask that? And what was your...
Yes. Yeah, totally. Yeah. Sometimes, we would get toward test time, and they would just really like the opportunity for me to just ask them questions, quiz them. So I would just ask as many questions that would come into my head. I would often set up a practice practical where it would be, let's just do 20 minutes. You're identifying 40 different structures across the board, cardiovascular structures, nerve structures, muscles, bones, and then just practice that. Then, it also identifies what you don't know. Okay, I know this part really, really well, but I don't know this other component, because most of the time people don't have to study everything to do well on a test. They just have to identify the parts that they don't know well. And so, like with your basketball example for yourself, maybe your team has inbound passes are fine, but then it's like the pick and roll and the motion, we're all over the place, this is not working. So then you just...
Have you seen us practice? You know exactly what our issues are. We got some fundamentals we work on.
Fill in my
So yeah, and that maybe this kind of brought up this other myth that I was thinking about. This idea that if it feels familiar, I've learned it. This idea that if I'm not testing myself and I'm reading back through my notes, I'm looking at a diagram. I'm just looking at a labeled diagram, and it feels very familiar. And we can trick ourselves into thinking, oh, I know this stuff. Yeah, that is the deltoid muscle. That's right. That's labeled correctly. And you're reading. Well, I mean, that's way easier than the actual performance, right? It would be like me reading about how to do a pick and roll without simulating and actually running through it.
Yes.
It'd be about me reading theory on how to shoot better with better form, but not actually going to the gym and shooting some baskets. So I think students have this myth that if it feels familiar, I learn it. And they wouldn't say that, but a lot of times they're kind of their actions. And the corollary of that then is, to really know it, you have to prove it. You have to go do the thing. And in this case, it was a lot of your students going to you and saying, hey, can you give me a practical? Can you ask me questions? And even that idea scares me as a student. Like, I don't know if I ever went to a professor's office hours, hardly at all, but going there and being like, hey, could you quiz me on this thing? So one, that's awesome that you had students that do that. But I think a lot of students out there maybe watching this video don't know that that's a thing that they can do. Like, you can just go to your professor's office hours and say, hey, can you ask me some questions? Because I want to see if I really know this. And I think most professors want their students to learn and be successful, right? So that's just a cool thing that I wouldn't have thought about doing. But the big idea there is we're going somewhere and we're getting some practice and retrieving that information from our brain. Like, we've got to prove it. To really learn it, we've got to prove it. And that's not to say that you have to do that out loud or with your professor, but some retrieval practice, whether it's writing it down.
Yeah.
A lot of times for me, I'll just, like, on my own, sort of in my head, I'll go through, and if I'm doing the bones of the hand, I'll be like, so long to pinky, here comes this, scaphoid, lunate. Like, I'll go through those and just, like, label them on my hand, not out loud, maybe just under my breath. But that's a way of practicing. And if I don't know one of those, then I find out that I don't know it, and then I go back and look it up, right? But I'm going through that effortful retrieval to build those better connections in my brain.
Yeah, and I think, like, related to those ideas is the kind of the rote memorization and sort of just regurgitating what's there is it truly, like, is not knowing it in and out. Because if you think about, like, if we go back to the example, the basketball example, you might know, abstractly how to set a pick, but then the person you're setting the pick on does something that you've never thought of ever. Like, they twirl around or move in a certain way or whatever. And, like, okay, how do I pick this person? So it's like, okay, deltoid muscle, but then, okay, they ask a follow-up question. Does that muscle initiate abduction? Well, I hadn't really thought about that. No. Or, just that little wrinkle. And I think, related to professors too, I think most professors just truly appreciate the content. They love it. That's why they're continuing to teach it. And I think also what happens is just an honest, like, they take their own knowledge for granted. Like, I know this stuff. I know it very well. And I don't really understand always the gap between somebody trying to learn it and, what I know, or what other professors know. And professors aren't perfect in their knowledge either. Like, if we teach something new, we have to really spend some time looking, researching and learning how to convey it to another person. And so, yeah, there's different layers there.
Yeah. That made me think of this idea, and I've heard this from students too. I remember having a conversation with a student, and the student told me, hey, I understand it when you explain it, and I write it in my notes. But then when you ask the questions on the test, you ask them differently. And I remember probing the student's, brain a little bit more about this and saying, and I came to realize that the student was literally saying, why isn't the definition that we write in our notes, I was teaching high school level, why isn't the definition that we wrote in our notes the same as the answer choice on the test?
Yeah.
And there's this idea of, okay, that student is really trying to engage in rote memorization and not deep understanding. And so, they were getting tripped up on the test asks this in a slightly different way. And that's another thing that I think students struggle with too, is you learn this information to some level of depth, and then you go to the test and you've got to be ready to answer questions on it that you've never seen them maybe ask in that exact same way.
Mm-hmm.
So what are the ways that we can push students to develop this deeper understanding so that they're able to answer those kind of curveball type questions that are still in the same content? They're not unfair questions, but they're not being asked exactly the same. Like how do we build that transferability?
And that is a kind of an ongoing question I've asked myself, because I will get approached in a very similar way. Like it almost seems like you're asking a question in a riddle. Like, well, I'm not trying to do that, but you sort of have to ask a question in sort of the framework of a typical test, whether it be now there can be variation in how you test, but there's typically true false, multiple choice, multiple choice, K type, where you're like, A and B are correct, C and D are correct, and it can get kind of complicated. But I think if you truly understand the content kind of backward and forward, from all different angles, you can do a lot better. And that does speak to the training idea, but it also, like, I think something that's maybe undervalued in any type of classroom, high school, college, graduate school, is just learning how to take a test. Professors could maybe do a little bit more of like thinking through, okay, how do you take a test? Can you eliminate answers? Can you, if you're able to write on a test, can you just cross stuff out that's a distractor? And you just don't even think about that answer choice anymore. But I think ultimately it is about understanding the content very, very well and trying to get at, okay, what's the question that's being asked? What is the professor truly getting at here? And every once in a while, there's probably one question on a test that's poorly written, and like maybe the answer wasn't even on there. And that happens. I've had a test like that too.
Yeah. It makes me think. I was talking to somebody recently, an adult, and we were talking about his journey through school, and he was telling me how he would get wrapped up in the little details of things on a question. So he may really kind of know the right answer, but then he's getting into these like technicalities and kind of just overthinking the idea. And I kind of told him one of the reasons that I did pretty well with tests, I think, is I was able to think from the perspective of the test creator, whether that was the teacher, professor, or they got that test question from somewhere, and think, were they really trying to test me on this random tiny piece of technicality knowledge, or are they really just trying to get at this major underlying principle? Let me go with the answer that kind of goes with that major underlying principle. I don't have a great example of that right now, but being able to think from the perspective of what are they really trying to test me on here, I think can be effective. Another idea that kind of goes with this that I've been thinking about is this idea of how novice learners tend to work kind of linearly through information. Like if you're reading a chapter of a textbook, let's say, and you're trying to learn this information, you're going to start with like the first sentence and really try to understand it and go through, versus a more of an efficient or expert learner is going to kind of work in some different levels. And so they're going to start with big picture first. So as an example, if I'm learning the digestive system, before I dive into what the pancreas does and what the small intestine does, I'm first going to be like, what's the big picture? What does the digestive system do? Like what's the purpose of the system? Oh, okay. It's digestion, it's absorption, and then it's elimination. All right. So there's these three big functions that we have to do. And then now as I go through these different organs, and maybe I follow the path through the digestive tract linearly, but now I'm thinking in terms of these three, and I start to categorize things, and I start to realize, oh, okay, it's the large and small intestine that are about absorption. I can categorize that. It's the oral cavity, the stomach, and the duodenum of the small intestine. Those are the digestion ones. And then I can start to break down, well, it's the stomach and the oral cavity that's for mechanical digestion. And then the chemical digestion is all of those, and the duodenum, the small intestine. And it's all that to say, if I'm thinking about learning that system, it's better if I think in those levels. What's the big picture first? Let me get that structure and make sure I know that really well. And then I can start adding on details to that. Every time I learn an organ, I'm connecting it to one of those functions. And And then I get into like, oh, digestion's one of them. So we need all these enzymes. And so I'm learning about these different enzymes that I'm connecting that. And then I figure, oh, there's 3 types of molecules we have to break down. So every time I learn about an enzyme, I'm connecting it to lipids, proteins, or carbohydrates. It's going to connect to one of those. And so it ends up being this, I was never a big fan of mind mapping. I never really understood the purpose of it. But the more I think about learning and think about how I think about things, the more it's like, okay, it is this sort of map of connections that I'm making. And so I think that's something that I want to help students get better at. And it's one of the, I'm in the process of creating this course right now called the A&P Memory Lab. And the idea is that I'm going to use, in the context of anatomy and physiology, so we're going to use all A&P examples, really demonstrate for students, here's how to go about learning efficiently so they can keep up with this flood of information in their A&P class that they might be learning. And then for teachers that join this, I think we think that students should just know how to study, and studying is such a high level skill.
Yes, it is.
Right? It's not an easy thing to do. There's a lot going on when it comes to studying. There's encoding, there's retrieval, there's systemizing it, there's avoiding procrastination, there's all of these different cognitive things that are going on. And I think most teachers don't understand it super well. And so they never teach it to their students. So students, myself included, I haven't done a good job of this in my own classes. And so students don't know how to study effectively. But then we as teachers tend to start blaming our students. Like they're not studying enough. They're not, but we've never taught them how to do it, So that's kind of the point of this. I've been thinking about this stuff a lot as I'm creating this course, because I really want to help students kind of gain this skill that they can use for the rest of their lives. Like you never stop learning. Even now as I'm, working on my YouTube channel and creating an online business, do all this kind of stuff. Like there's so many skills that I'm learning. And so all this stuff is relevant at any stage of life, but students is where you feel it the most acutely, because you got these tests that you have to pass all the time,
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And I agree with what you said there. I think professors, if they could bring teachers could bring even in 10% more into their content. Okay, how to study, how to handle the information, how to prep for tests, and even just the standpoint of, like you mentioned here with what you're learning for, about podcasting, video making, sending out emails, being a business person, like you're learning all these little skills that you have to learn along the way. And even as somebody can get familiar with that feeling of like, I don't feel competent in this particular skill or this set of knowledge, and just be okay with that being there. Like, okay, yeah, you're going to probably experience this a lot, throughout life. I personally have experienced this, when I got married, when we had, kids, like having a house,
big learning curves and all those changes.
Like every day. Okay. I don't know how to do this either. And then you slowly learn how to do that. And I agree also with what you're saying about the linear. Like I think you can't short circuit the linear understanding of the GI system you gave the example for. Okay, what's the overall purpose of this system? Let's start with that, and we can't short circuit this understanding before we dive into the details of what's the pancreas doing. What's the purpose of the gallbladder? What is that doing? How is that different from what the pancreas is doing? And work from there. But and I think it is easy to sort of have the student as sometimes the scapegoat. Like they're not working hard. They don't want it hard enough. They don't want their A badly enough. Yeah. It's not quite, it can be true. I mean, there are some students who aren't doing, what they need to do, but it's often just like they want to do well, but there's just something missing for them, and they just need to find a better system for themselves.
That's the cycle I go through. Is they do, if they do bad on a test, I'm like, oh, these students, they didn't, and then I sit with it for a minute, and then I'm like, no, what did I not do that I could have done? Like, what's the thing that I could have given them to help them? So this like blame students first, and then be like, okay, what can I do as a teacher? And for me, a lot of times it's, hey, I need to teach them how to learn. Yeah. Right? Like I've not equipped them as well as I could. In this very complex process. So what can I do in my class that's going to help them do more active recall? How can I help them systematize that, where we're bringing these concepts from previous units back up in class more. So all this stuff that we're talking about, as a learner, it's important to know, but as a teacher, it's important to know so we can run our classes better, so that we can teach students how to learn better and all that kind of thing. I think it's super important.
Yeah, it's also like you don't want to go too far, the pendulum swinging too far in the other direction too, because it's not, we can internalize it and blame ourselves too much too. Like it was all on me. And the reality is like it's kind of a partnership of, I'm going to do my part as a teacher, professor, and then they're going to do their part as a learner, and we're going to kind of just do this dance together, so to speak, and hopefully they pick up as much content as possible.
Yeah, for sure. So we've talked about these different things that as students we need to do in order to learn better. And another thing that kind of comes up a lot is we've got all this information to learn, but also life's busy, right? Maybe you've got kids in a family, maybe you're in college and you're working a job, and you've got social activities that you're doing. You've got all these things that are demanding your attention. So what are some things that we can do to get in that extra study time, to systematize some of this stuff so we can kind of maximize our learning? Like, how do we actually make the time for these things?
Yeah, I think one of the biggest things, there's a few things, but one of the biggest things to do is just to be incredibly organized. Okay, where are my notes on blood flow through the heart? Where are my notes on the brachial plexus? Have them in a very easy location. It could be, maybe you use some apps on your phone, use the Notes app or Journal, and you have those at the ready, and you know exactly where those are. You subscribe to your channel, Justin, or my podcast.
There you go.
and you just you can fill what's quote unquote dead time, like taking your kid to soccer practice or, a commute to work. And you fill that time with listening to audio, and you just learn that way. And then also just use just a simple, I'll just call it a priming dose, where you actually just start with like 10 minutes. Like, okay, what do I need to learn? Where's the content for this particular topic? What's my, after that priming dose, once you get everything organized and know what you're going to do, and then kind of end with like, okay, what do I intend to learn today? Or what do I intend to review? And then, okay, I know I only got 40 minutes. How am I going to maximize this 40 minutes?
Yeah. So I'm hearing like you take this what you call a priming dose. You take this 5 minutes or so just to sit down and be like, okay, what am I trying to get done right now? And maybe that's where you're doing some of that chunking a little bit, where you're saying, hey, right now my top priority is to learn, the muscles of the upper arm right now, or whatever. I'm going to review those. So you're kind of like setting those goals for that study session at the beginning. Yeah, I think that's great. I also like having your materials at the ready, and I think that's one thing that students struggle with too. Is there's the stuff that I know that I need to learn, but where do I go to get it? And so it's just like getting the right kind of resources, right? Is it a textbook? Is it an app with 3D diagrams? Is it notes or slides from a professor? So one of the steps then to this whole process of systematizing all this is having kind of a central location where that, the kind of this idea of this external database. Where's my external database of information that I'm going to be pulling from each time? If you don't have that, then it becomes more kind of nebulous. Like, where am I getting all this information from?
It does.
And I think that's where a lot of students online are looking for. They're finding your podcast, they're finding my channel because they're like, I need a better external database of information to pull from.
Yeah, I totally agree. And it's also like customizing that. If somebody they need to read it, then all their materials need to kind of lean into that reading component. If they're a listener, then they need to just bias in that direction. But I think parts of our earlier conversation about just, it is effective with anatomy to kind of incorporate these different things, in particular, just this kinesthetic idea, like moving it around on yourself. But I think just set yourself up for the win as much as possible. Like, you need to just customize it as much as possible for yourself. And if a listener is organized in nothing else except for this, because this is what they need to do. And, if their house is a mess or their dishes are a mess, but they master this, like that's a win.
Yeah. That's great. Anything else as far as this when life is busy kind of stuff and studying more effectively?
Yeah, I think try to it seems like students need to lower the bar a little bit. Like we sort of get into our head, if we need to have these 4 hours of blocked out time to study. But the reality, that's probably not going to happen in the context of, let's just say, an adult learner who has a family, has kids, has a job. That is very difficult to do. So maybe a person just needs to find, like, what is an optimum dose for themselves. Like if we think of the exercise example, a lot of people don't have time to do a full hour workout, but maybe 25 minutes is your sweet spot, and you can do 6 different exercises, maybe a minimal amount of rest between the exercises, but you can get a good workout in. Same thing with studying. Like, okay, it doesn't even have to be on the fives. Like, we don't have to have 25, 30, 35. It could be 27 minutes. You have 27 minutes. There's nothing that says that you have to have multiples of 5 or multiples of 10 or multiples of 1 hour. So it's just sort of being flexible with that.
Yeah, I really like this. I like coming back to this training metaphor, right? This comparing it to going and working out. Like I'm not going to go do a 4-hour workout, but it'd be better if I did maybe a daily workout for 30 minutes, right?
Yeah.
And I think that's just that's just a helpful mindset shift for those that do workouts and that sort of thing. If you don't do that, if you've never gone to workout, it's maybe not as helpful of a metaphor. But I think this idea of when I sit down to study, I'm sitting down to train my brain with this new information. Like I'm thinking of it as a training session. I should get sweaty at the end of it. I should be working hard. I should be, maybe not literally sweaty, but like I'm working hard. I'm putting in effort. This feels like work. And at the end of it, I'm going to feel really good.
Yes.
That I did that,
Yeah.
So I think that's just a powerful mindset shift that we can make.
Yeah. And if in some days, like depending on what you're doing, you can do a lot in 10 minutes, and it's better to have that 10 minutes than it is to have 0 minutes. So if that's just what it is that particular day, now of course don't hang your hat on that. Like you need more time than that to really learn the content, but that you just sort of have to go with what you got on some days.
Yeah. Awesome. Well, I want to kind of end with maybe asking, if you had one piece of advice, and I'll share my answer too. If you had one piece of advice to students who are learning anatomy, what would be the one thing that you'd tell them that every student needs to hear?
Yeah, I think just be a little graceful and gentle with yourself. Just you probably, like, anatomy sort of self-selects for people studying anatomy, self-selects for kind of high achievers, I think, in general. People that are, maybe pursuing medicine or other clinical specialty down the road. And so they're probably used to being able to kind of nail things pretty easily. Other topics, and then once they get to anatomy, it can be very, very challenging. So just be okay with that part, and let your confidence slowly grow. Be aware of the fact that you're probably going to get freaked out, and just slowly move past that. Move past that comfort and let your confidence grow. And then, so that's just sort of an overall strategy, and I'll leave it there. But you can of course go beyond that and have a lot of tactics too. But that's just sort of an overall kind of mindset for how to approach that.
Yeah, love it. I think my answer would be, just as a YouTuber, I make these videos. I try to break things down as clearly as I can. And one thing I always do at the end of videos is I give a blank diagram, and I always say something along the lines of, if you really want to learn this, you got to practice it yourself. And I say, pause the video, practice this blank diagram. So I think my advice, if I had one piece of advice to tell students, is if you watch my video or you listen to Seth's podcast, Anatomy on the Go, and at the end of it, you stop there and you feel like, oh, I understood that really well. I think I would caution you to prove it. actually do the thing, pause the video, pause the podcast, try to say that information back out. If it's the podcast, if it's a video, try to sketch out the diagram that I drew in the video and re-explain it. If you don't do that step, the information will not stick in your brain as well as it could if you take that extra step and do that. I think it's always, my advice is always going to say, push yourself to actually retrieve the information, do something with the information. Don't just listen to the video. Don't just listen to the podcast, because at the end of the day, those are really passive ways of learning, right? The passive part's important, but then you have to immediately follow up with the active part. So that would be kind of my advice. So Seth, remind us again, where can students find your resources? Like, what are the things you've got going on that you want to share?
Yeah, you can go to any podcast app and just search for Anatomy on the Go. You can also just go to my website, anatomyonthego.com, get your free ebook. Just confirm your email and ready to go. I'll be sending out some emails to you.
Yeah, and Seth's ebook has a list of strategies and things to use, so it can be very helpful if you're learning anatomy, and you need some actual practical strategies to use. So check that out. And then for my stuff, of course, you're already here on the channel. The big thing that I'm working on right now is my A&P Memory Lab course. So if that sounds like something that you're interested in, and you want to learn more about how to study well and actually get feedback on that, and that sort of thing, I've got a waitlist link in the description that you can click to join that waitlist. We've got over 300 people on the waitlist right now, which is pretty cool. It's just a sign that there's a lot of people that want to learn how to learn anatomy and physiology better. So this is it's a need that's out there, and I'm excited to kind of share with students how to actually go about learning and leveling up that skill. So, all right, Dr. Seth Jump, thanks so much for joining, and yeah, this has been great.
Thanks a lot, Justin. It was fun chatting with you today. I appreciate it.
Yeah. Awesome.
Hey, thanks for watching the video. Let me know in the comments what's something that you're going to do differently or maybe add to your studying as a result of this video, or what's a mindset shift that you've had as a result of this video. Thanks again for watching. I'll see you in the next video. Bye-bye.